And that reminds me that this is our penultimate session, which is really bittersweet that we're coming to the end of reading this poem together. So it's wonderful to see you all here again. And let's get into it. So today we're talking about books 17 through 20. Last time we met, Odysseus had just revealed his identity to his son Telemachus alone. And the two of them in Eumaeus's hut had started to formulate some plans for how they're going to take vengeance on the suitors and regain possession of the household. In these books, we sort of start to see that plan come into motion, but nothing's really happened yet. So we've moved from being just on Ithaca to being in the very center of Odysseus's palace. And I have to admit that in trying to come up with a summary for this, I found it really difficult because actually so much happened within that very confined space. So I'll try to draw out a few of the main things that happened, and just a note on the summary I'm about to give. Throughout, you'll hear me refer to Odysseus as the stranger in most cases. And that's just to remind us that to pretty much everyone except for Telemachus and Athena at this point, people are encountering him in his beggar disguise and believing it, right? So in book 17, we are moved from Eumaeus's hut to Odysseus's palace. This happens first when Telemachus goes, and he tells his mother all about what he experienced with Nestor and Menelaus. Eumaeus and the stranger follow shortly thereafter, and along the way they encounter Melanthius, the swine or goat herd, rather, who assaults the stranger, and they also see Argos, which is Odysseus's old dog, who dies at just the sight of the stranger. Once they're inside the palace, the stranger tries to recount his story to the suitors and beg them for food. Neither of these is received very well. Antinous, the suitor, hurls a footstool at his head, or back, rather. But Penelope is intrigued and she wants to question the stranger, and they decide that ultimately this shouldn't happen until night, with a little bit more privacy. In book 18, we actually meet another beggar figure, a man called Eris, and the suitors urge Eris to fight with the stranger, who quickly strikes him down. And the suitors are so pleased by this that they offer the stranger a meal, and one of them, Amphinomus, even toasts the stranger. And Amphinomus alone is the only one that actually seems to feel some sort of foreboding when the stranger says that Odysseus, in fact, is quite nearby. Penelope, meanwhile, comes down before all the suitors, and she's been made more beautiful by Athena. And her goal is to solicit more bride gifts. The night ultimately comes to an end when Telemachus puts a stop to it because Eurymachus throws a footstool and there's a huge commotion. While the suitors sleep in book 19, Telemachus and the stranger get to work hiding all of the weapons in the hall off in a storeroom. And then finally, Penelope and the stranger actually have a chance to speak. He tells her about a time that he met Odysseus, and he adds certain details to make Penelope certain that this might have actually happened. He also tells her that Odysseus will return very soon. Penelope asks Eurycleia, Odysseus's nurse, to bathe the stranger, and Eurycleia immediately recognizes that the stranger is in fact Odysseus when she feels a scar on his leg. Penelope doesn't seem to notice, and the two continue talking. Penelope tells the stranger about a dream she had that seemed to prophesy the homecoming of Odysseus and the slaughter of the suitors. And she tells him about her plans to hold a contest for her hand in marriage, in which all of the suitors will be invited to participate. In book 20, Odysseus, or the stranger, wakes up and hears Penelope crying. He prays to Zeus for an omen to prove that his homecoming indeed does have divine support. Thunder flashes, and a lone female slave sees it and makes a prayer that today will be the suitor's final feast. The palace then comes alive with preparations for the day. Herdsmen enter, and among them, Philœtius makes a wish that Odysseus will come home. Meanwhile, the seer Theoclymenus uh, prophesies destruction for all of the suitors, who do not listen. And as they continue to taunt Telemachus and his guests, the book closes with an image of Penelope sitting in the halls, listening, overhearing everything that they're saying. So these books really offer us a dense and vivid description of what's happening inside the palace. And it's my pleasure to introduce our faculty guest for today, Professor Sherry Chiai Lee, who's going to help us dive deeper into these complex books and understand what it means for Odysseus to really come home. Professor Lee's research focuses on archaic and Hellenistic Greek poetry, as well as the scholarly traditions of ancient Alexandria. She is broadly interested in ancient concepts of authorship and authenticity, and is currently writing a monograph on the distinctive history of authorship in Greek epigram, tracing practices from anonymity to pseudepigraphy. Her research also addresses modern communicative approaches to ancient language pedagogy. Over the past 7 years, she has taught ancient Greek and Latin as active languages, emphasizing speaking and writing alongside reading. She's done this in Taiwan, in Greece, and in the US, and is excited to bring these methods to Berkeley. And I can add, I've had the pleasure of sitting in on a few of these sessions. It's really wonderful. So thank you so much for being here today, Professor Lee. I turn over the floor to you. I can't wait to hear what you're going to say about these books.
Thank you so much, Cecily, and hello to everybody who's joining us for book 17 to 20 of the Odyssey on Zoom. This is wonderful to see so much enthusiasm. And also, if you're in the penultimate stretch, this means you really stuck it out. You want to see this through to the end. So I'm glad to be here for this part of the journey that you've been going on all semester. And I'm really, really excited also to have a group of people to speak to and ask your thoughts on about these really, really enigmatic books, which I personally love a lot. I'm sure many of you became acquainted with the Odyssey maybe through books 9 to 12, the Apologoi of Odysseus, the sort of most famous adventure books. This is certainly the first portion of the Odyssey that I was acquainted with as a child. And then when I was a bit older, as an undergraduate, I read the Odyssey in translation as well as the Iliad. And I really became drawn to the Oikos book of the Odyssey, the homecoming, Odysseus returning. I find them to be so psychologically rich. We get such a panoply of characters of all different classes that we really aren't exposed to in this much detail in other parts of the epic. Um, and I mean, for me, I had the great fortune to be advised by a Homerist in undergrad and a Homerist in graduate school, and read the Odyssey and the Iliad in ancient Greek fully with both of them. So I really think of Homer as like a path not taken. And this book club has given me the opportunity to really think about translation and also to read Mendelssohn's translation, which I wasn't acquainted with before having this wonderful opportunity. So it's a really nice chance to think about experiencing the Odyssey as a story in English. So I'm very grateful to all of you. So with books 17 to 20, I just find them to be rich with so much incredible dramatic tension. They're so psychologically rich, quite apart from the fact that all of the characters who are in the know or have premonitions are dropping not terribly subtle hints that Odysseus is right there, about to get back to the house, about to unleash havoc and divine punishment. I find all of the ways that the characters are sizing each other up across all of the different classes to be so interesting. And we really get a sense of not just how Odysseus operates in disguise, but also how Telemachus and Penelope are much more nuanced and complex figures than perhaps they appeared at the beginning of the epic. We see them similarly testing each other, testing the suitors, even testing Odysseus. And so I'm very interested in the complexity that you all picked up as well in reading these books. So with these books, Odysseus has returned, but in disguise, and we immediately see the way that his return introduces quite a lot of disruption as he begins to aggressively assess the situation at home, take stock of everyone's loyalties, and subject everybody from the enslaved people in his household to his son and his wife and people who've known him in a caretaker capacity, like Eurycleia, to tests, moral tests, ethical tests. And he's interestingly very aggressive about doing this, you know? We see many moments of sentiment, like the Argo scene more famously, but rereading these books, especially in the English translation this time, what really struck me is just how single-minded Odysseus is about subjecting his beloved Penelope and all his other loved ones to these tests, and he really doesn't compromise on them. And so hopefully we'll get to discuss later on what we think of Odysseus, the master manipulator, bringing this manipulative skill back home. Does it make sense at this moment of return? Does it make sense for him to subject his family and his household to his trickster mentality, which served him very well during his journey, but now exposes different tensions and also exposes Odysseus as a much more, I think, morally ambiguous figure than we might expect, given that he's the one putting everybody through these tests. And I know that's something that people have asked questions about, the moral ambiguity, which is so much a centerpiece of these books. I think I'm a big like Henry James and Edith Wharton novel fan. I like novels where not a lot of action happens, but people are always sizing each other up psychologically. So if you like those kinds of novels, perhaps book 17 to 20 spoke to you as well. And also this idea that we explore the oikos through the idea of somebody who's on the margins, economically and socially disenfranchised, but somebody who's clearly controlling the situation with the help of Athena. We get so many lies, false narratives, omens, and intrigues. And we might think about how this complicates this idea that I'm sure you've all been familiar with from earlier books of the epic of guest culture and the obligations of xenia, hospitality, and how those are and aren't violated on both sides with Odysseus coming back home. Um, and this idea that we see for the first time, I think, all the different constituent groups and social strata of the household, the suitors, the maidservants, Telemachus, Penelope, Theoclymenus, who's also a stranger inhabiting the home. And we get a real sense of all the divisions and alliances between everybody, and also the possibility of violence between both the elite and the non-elite characters of the household. Most obviously, of course, with the disguised Odysseus squaring off against the suitors, but also the way that Melanthius threatens Eumaeus and, threatens to sell him into slavery, which is a threat that we see the elite suitors often launching against the enslaved or servile class in the household. And this conflict that Odysseus gets drawn into with Iris, where he's basically put into, a cockfighting ring for the suitors' entertainment. There are all these social situations that we haven't seen before. Um, and we also get for the first time the focalization of these sometimes completely unnamed non-elite characters, where how they feel about Odysseus coming back, whether they pray for Odysseus to return. And so we get a sense of also non-elite religious life, their relationships to the gods potentially. Cecily just pointed out this wonderful moment with the elderly enslaved woman who prays for Odysseus to come back. On the other side, Melanthius prays for Telemachus to be shot by Apollo. We see Melantho repeatedly antagonizing Odysseus. So there's a reversal, really, of a lot of unsettling of social hierarchies that we might be used to if we are familiar with the Iliadic world or with the world that Odysseus has been passing through the earlier books in this epic. So, kind of the major themes I feel of books 17 to 20. Firstly, recognition and misrecognition, and respect despite misrecognition, right? Like, who sees Odysseus for who he is, who gets the sense that perhaps, even if they don't know that this is Odysseus, that there might be something going on below the surface. Perhaps this is a god in disguise and to test the household. And they should nevertheless uphold the rules of xenia, even though they don't know who this is, who fails to recognize Odysseus. and also the ways that the different recognition scenes throughout book 17 to 20 operate. So we get Argos, and we get Eurycleia, and there's a lot of talk and a lot of wordplay that goes on between Odysseus and Penelope, which I find to be the most exciting moment of book 17 to 20. But there are also these two scenes where Odysseus is perceived via sensory signs or semata, and that's kind of a big theme. The way that he ends up giving himself away even though his body is ostensibly transformed by Athena, he still manages to be recognized in these somatic, nonverbal ways, which is interesting because Odysseus is the master of rhetoric, and we see Penelope having to match him in order to work through these scenes of potential recognition, but negotiating with this stranger who shows up saying that he knows her husband. Um, but with Argos, um, in book 17, we get this word in Greek, enoisen, and then I think Mendelssohn translates it as sensed. He sensed that Odysseus was near, and so there's this idea that maybe he recognizes him by smell, um, and that's after 20 years, which is an extremely moving idea. And Eurycleia later on in book 19 recognizes Odysseus by the scar on his leg and by holding the same foot that she held once when he was first injured as a boy. So this idea of physical recognition that persists despite long distance. So we might touch on these themes as we go forward. And each time Odysseus has to kind of conceal his emotions. We see him constantly, in these rare moments of sentiment, which is sort of complicated in the case of Penelope, which I want to get into. But he has to restrain how he feels seeing Argos, and he sheds a tear, which is very, very moving. Yeah, I also shed a tear the first time reading of the Argos scene. I'm glad everybody felt this way. But the fact that there's recognition and unintended recognition happening leads into the second theme, which is we see Odysseus' scheming now needing to take a much more restrained form. He has to really play into this idea of concealment and restraint before action. Here we see him biding his time. He tests everyone in his household. He gets the lay of the land. He also sets up individual tests for people, not just as the beggar when he goes around asking for food. He subjects Antinous to a special test. He says, "You are the most elite of all of them. You should actually give me more food and the best food that you can afford, not just your average Xenia." But he really invents very craftily trials for everybody that he encounters. Um, and this gets us into this third idea that I want to track, which is the really troubled nature of hospitality or guest host culture or xenia in these books. We know that the suitors have violated this constantly, and we know that this is set up, at least initially, as the justification for what's about to befall them. But what I always find interesting reading these books, especially in light of all that we've seen, and maybe Odysseus's moral ambiguity has been a topic of conversation so far in earlier books, is that it makes us revisit earlier scenes from Odysseus's journey. How has he maybe violated or skirted the obligations of Xenia as a trial? How do we feel about him now subjecting the suitors to this trial now, Athena as well? And when he's asked, tell us about your identity, tell us where you've been, all in good faith, we will give you food, we will give you clothing, despite you being a beggar. He repeatedly invents very elaborate stories, and he, not very subtly, will say things like, "I used to be a great king myself, and then I had this peripeteia, I had this reversal of fortune. Um, this may happen to you," more or less. So we might think about whether or not Odysseus, from his own end, in maintaining this lie, and really threatening people to help him maintain it, says Telemachus is the only one who knows who he really is. Does he, in some way, also violate his own end of the Xenia exchange? Um, and in doing so, do we think the suitors see themselves as acting in the right in some way, in kind of trying to protect their very fragile, society from being disrupted by this beggar who has now come in. And so by way of getting into these topics, I wanted to address some of the questions that people brought up. So in I think starting in book 17, we start to see how people are responding to Odysseus, and we get the suitors re-meeting him and showing themselves in worse and better light, of course. So Richard asks, chapters 17 to 20 take place on Ithaca. Even though Odysseus has been gone 20 years, some characters on Ithaca revere him. Yet, based on these chapters, I'm not quite clear why, which is an excellent question. We've seen Odysseus revered and respected and challenged by his own men. We've seen him, if you've read the Iliad, in his capacity as a commander when he's in a situation of war, interacting with people of his own social stratum. But here we see him in a really new context, which is at home, both through the perspective of those who work for him in his household and this new community of suitors who are also aristocratic elite men who each have their own household. Um, and so we see that he is clearly beloved by several select members of his staff. It seems that everybody except for Melanthius the goatherd and some of the maidservants, most notably Melantho, seem to respect him. They long for his return. They pray for him to be saved and to not turn out to be perished, as everybody suspects. And we know that he has this reputation for being respected for his intelligence and his cunning among those in his elite class. And there's this anecdote that Menelaus tells and that Telemachus then repeats at the beginning of book 17 when he's conferencing with Penelope of Odysseus successfully wrestling a man in Lesbos, and he's apparently renowned for this. So he also has some kind of physical martial prowess as well, not just intellectual acumen. So he's really capable, someone that people respect in many ways, for many different elements. And it's the suitors who don't seem to be cognizant of this. And, it's either that they don't believe that he really will come back, or that they don't seem to recognize his superiority, which Odysseus, in his guise as beggar who completely, doesn't know who Odysseus is or only saw him at a distance, continuously brings up to threaten them. And relatedly, Gunnar asks, the long-standing presence of the horde of suitors at Odysseus' home seems a bit far-fetched. Is it at all based on historical evidence of such practices, or is it just a plot device to create a final grand obstacle for the hero? Another really, really great question, since we don't get a great kind of overview of the social situation on Ithaca, and this is really new for us as we're coming into 17 to 20. And so, as I mentioned, the suitors are these aristocratic young men who come from Ithaca and also the neighboring islands. They belong to elite households. And so it's not uncommon for all of these eligible bachelors to want to seek the widow or the presumed widow of somebody as renowned as Odysseus, who has the wealth and the dowry and the household that she has. And we see like the entire Trojan War, of course, is rooted in a pact among elite men throughout Greece to uphold the marriage of Helen to whatever prince she chooses. And so we do have other episodes in the Trojan War cycle and the Homeric tradition of elite men vying for a very eligible woman's hand. But of course, we see a really heightened version of what we might see as plausible social tensions among aristocratic Greek men in these books in particular. The scale and the behavior of the suitors, dozens of men camping out for years, we presume, openly consuming the household's resources, refusing to leave, maybe push at the boundaries of even what we've seen elsewhere in in the Homeric tradition. And what's interesting is that there hasn't really been any retaliation in a concrete sense from these men's kin networks or neighboring elites. They all seem to be united in the belief that they just need to stick it out until Penelope chooses them. And so it's maybe more a testament to Penelope's ability to maintain this artificial courtship or of this suspended courtship for a long time that produces this like aggravated consumption situation that we find in the Odyssey. Because we don't get, a really escalated hostile takeover. We just get this sense that there's civic strife because we have all of these men camped out at one man's house, and trying to actively prevent Telemachus in a material sense from being able to replace his father as the ruler of the household. So, something that we should be attentive to, also looking forward to books 21 to 24, is what would happen if Odysseus were to wipe out all of these eligible aristocratic men who are leaders of their community in their own way. And presumably, he may have had dealings or diplomatic communications or relations with their fathers or their relatives. So it's a really unstable situation for everybody if they're putting themselves in this very antagonistic position to Odysseus. And we know that they're all going to be, they will all suffer, not to spoil what will happen, although I think 17 to 20 spoils that for us. So, yeah, what happens if Odysseus destroys all of the other leaders in his community? We would potentially have a tyranny, which is another undesirable artificial political situation, that the epic definitely exposes as a tension for us. Um, so what I wanted to ask related to this, since in book 17 we already get these multiple instances of abuse from Antinous, from Melanthius, that only gets worse as we progress through these books. I wanted to just start by asking everybody how they feel about the suitors. So I have this QR code that will lead you to a poll. I'll pop the link as well in the chat. I think I can send this. And then I will also share my screen briefly so people can click into this QR code. And so the question I want to pose to everybody is, what do we make of the suitors' moral culpability? Do we think they're all blameworthy? Do we think they all deserve the punishment that we know is coming for them? Why or why not? So I'll give everybody a minute, and I think I should be able to access everyone's responses.
Just confirming that the link does work.
Yeah. Yeah. And so while everybody's populating the poll, thanks, Cecily. Um, there are clearly differences between the suitors, right? We see some of them trying to hold the others back. We see some of them offering food to the disguised Odysseus. Um, so they're not presented as a monolith, although their punishment is uniform. And we really get a sense of this in these books. So are people able to? Okay, this is great. I'm gonna give everybody a couple more seconds. Oh, this is so great. People have very strong feelings about this. I'm so glad. Okay, I'm gonna start reading a couple of gems. Yes, frat boys gone wild. Kill them all. Another person says, not all equally. Some are guilty, others are pitiable. Um, Nearly all of them seem to be too selfish and overstayed their welcome. I love this one. Don't they have other lives? These guys sound like pathetic losers who just want to party. This is also true. They are being manipulated to some extent by Athena, so they're not completely to blame. Blameworthy, yes. Punishable by death, no. That's a really, really great point. Yes, trying to kill the sun is unforgivable. They did, some of them did do this. A good majority of them did plot this. Um, yes, they're parasites, bring no honor to Penelope. No, because Penelope leads them on. Interesting. Absolutely. I'm thinking that Penelope must be some great catch. Yes, she is, especially after the makeover in 1819, but the suitors are crazy. Okay. All right. So I think we do have strong feelings about the suitors being blameworthy, and I'm seeing an interesting um uh divergence between people who think that the suitors should all be brutally killed and those who think that they should just be punished, right? So, another thing to think about foreshadowing for the next book club is um, does the punishment they get, a divinely motivated and driven punishment, merit what is a political situation with like real social ramifications for everybody on Ithaca? And as people are kind of pointing out, there are differences in the ways that the suitors treat Odysseus. Antinous is just seems to be the extreme end of the spectrum, where he's most hostile. And despite being told this tale by Odysseus in 340, pages 342 to 343 about him being a Cypriot um, king who has now been hard on his luck and has showed up as a beggar to the household. He abuses him and calls him a panhandler. Um, but otherwise, we do see that there's some fracture lines between them. Some of the suitors try to restrain the others from, abusing the beggar, from mistreating him. And we also see, interestingly, multiple times that it's brought up that Telemachus hasn't done anything to stop them, right? So we see Telemachus slowly coming into a position of authority. But part of the trial is also that, Odysseus says, "Well, no, nobody has stopped anybody from abusing me in my guise as a beggar." And he goes to Penelope and says, "Your son hasn't done anything to stop them either." And Penelope is then activated to do something about this. Um, so this related to another question that Mark asks, which is addressing the issue of moral agency in the Odyssey. So, for example, Antinous has foreboding as to the righteousness of his conduct, but Athena does not allow him to escape his fate in Book 18, page 353. Is his decision to stay morally blameworthy or not? There are other examples of the sailors, Odysseus's companions' conduct, eating forbidden sheep after being warned, as being acts of stupidity, not that they were compelled by the gods. So, how is the moral standard to be established? And I think that's one of the great themes of these books is that we're constantly reevaluating both Odysseus and the suitors because we get a much more nuanced picture of them once we're in the oikos and we're seeing all the ways that they interact. Um, and this question of punishment, right? Like is also this idea that they aren't a monolith, but they have the same punishment, they have the same end. And Odysseus is very uncompromising about this. Kind of points to the futility in some way of the tests as they're ongoing, right? Odysseus Athena pushes Odysseus at some point to go around begging and asking for food from all of the suitors. But then they have this line over and over, but she had already plotted death for all of them. So one wonders, like, why is she goading Odysseus on if the test isn't a real test? If there isn't, a coming and some of the suitors will be spared and others not, if the same fate awaits all of them, why show us all this moral complexity? Why show us also Odysseus acting in morally gray ways if we know that the same fate awaits all of them? And I think that really raises this. It's a hard question to answer, but I think it raises the stakes for loyalty. And I think it allows us to see Odysseus's homecoming not necessarily as this righteous ruler sweeping back in, but it puts the test that he decides to subject everybody to in a much more complex light. It really makes us question why he's doing this, why Athena is so involved in getting him to a place where he's willing to even kill Eurycleia if she exposes his identity to everybody. Um, so in book 19, in book 18, the end of book 18, we start to get a sense also of Penelope coming into her own and starting a sense of how she's been, very wily herself. Um, I really, really, there's this really little like subtle moment in book 18 on page 356, lines 259, where she narrates to the suitors this alleged story about Odysseus entrusting her with these instructions before leaving. And so around like 259, she says that Odysseus told her, "My wife, I do not think that the sturdy grieved Achaeans will all make their way back from home safe and sound. For people say that the Trojans are men who know how to fight. So, sleeping a little bit, I don't know if the god will bring me back or if I'll be taken there in Troy, but you must see to everything here. And once you see our son starting to grow out his beard, marry whomever you wish and leave your house behind. Um, so she's also very tricky. We don't, we don't have the sense that Odysseus really did say, marry whomever you wish once the son's beard comes in. This is fine. Take another suitor. Um, and she does this to extort all of these fabulous gifts from the suitors that we get at the end of 18. And Odysseus is listening. And on page 357, on line 281, we see Odysseus's response. And he says, Odysseus, who had suffered so much, rejoiced because she'd wheedled gifts out of them and had bewitched their hearts with the alluring words she had spoken, though her intentions were quite different. So we really get a sense of Penelope, who's a good match for Odysseus. She gets them to bring these wonderful gifts, these lavish parade of treasures at the end. And Odysseus is pleased by this, even though he's misrepresented clearly his intentions to the entire community. So this is a great first sign that we get that now Odysseus and Penelope are going to engage in this like battle of wits a little bit, where they're each not being fully transparent, I think, at least, about what they know, what they think the other person, who they think the other person is, what they think the other person's intentions are, um, which they keep up until the trial is ultimately unavoidable. Um, so yeah, and then this moment that Mark mentioned is on the next page 359 about Athena not allowing the proud-hearted suitors to seize their soul-rending outrages to provoke Odysseus more. So again, another question of are the suitors maybe also driven mad? Would they act otherwise? Because they've been under, it is a really artificial state of being that they've been under. Would they have acted this way had Athena maybe not been partly responsible for this? Penelope also being responsible for prolonging this delay before the courtship. Just more layers to add on to our sense of the suitor's culpability. And so the scene that I really am so excited to get into is book 19. um, and so on 365, page 365 in book 19 is where we start to get this conversation between Penelope and Odysseus, who is still, of course, in disguise, and he's very, very coy with not telling her initially who he is. And then she narrates to him all that she's been doing. She's been disclosing, she's been uh, keeping the suitors at bay with this trick. So this is also, she gives such an extended account of like exactly how she's been keeping the suitors at bay, but it's really a breaking point that it's almost a way, I think, like this is certainly a way that this speech has been read is like, I've been doing my best to keep them at bay. I'm signaling to you that you need to precipitate some kind of crisis. You need to come forward and say something because I've been holding down the fort for 20 years and I'm just keeping it down. But now is the moment that we want Odysseus to come back. And I feel that he's near, as other people have been saying, but she is also um, very, very cynical about it. Like, I've given up hope. No, I think he's dead. Um, and I think this can be read as her provoking him, to reveal his identity. So um, there's this really, he tells another story. Before he was the Cypriot lord turned, you know, beggar hard on his luck when he was talking to Antinous. But he tells her a different story when he is finally, when he finally relents and says, okay, I'll tell you my story. And this links to another question that somebody asked. So on page 367, starting on line 172, he tells this story and he begins by saying, there's a land called Crete in the middle of the wine-faced ocean, beautiful and fertile, surrounded by water, and in it there are people, many people, too many to count, and 90 cities. Every language is mixed with another one. There are Achaeans, there are great-hearted, true-born Cretans, and there are Cadonians too, and Dorians divided among three tribes, and glorious Pelasgians, and he goes on. And he casts himself as the brother of Idomeneus, who is the most famous of the Cretans. So this younger brother named Iphone. And he says, Odysseus I saw there, and I gave him gifts of welcome. Um, and he talks about how he welcomed him personally. And at this moment in the text, um, Larry made this observation uh, and he asks, someone in the text mentions a foreign language. I presume Greek was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean when Odysseus was puttering around. But would everyone have spoken it? Circe, Polyphemus, Calypso, the Libyans? I suspect Odysseus didn't use Google Translate, so it's remarkable to think everyone spoke Greek, which is a really great observation and kind of pulls us out to think about the construction of this text. And the general observation that I've been making, I was reading the Argonautica recently for a class, and of course, everybody there is speaking Greek as well, but we have Colchians um, and Greeks. And it's only when Medea is speaking to Circe, who is a Colchian herself, that the narrator for the first time says, and they conversed in the Colchian language. And that makes everybody, the reader, aware for the first time. Wait, so what language were they speaking when they were on Colchis? Were they speaking Greek? Were they speaking Colchian? And we weren't alerted to this the entire time. And a similar moment happens here when Odysseus is setting up this image of Crete that Larry did a great job of picking up on. But it's interesting because they're all Greeks. This is the first time that we get in the Odyssey, at least, that we get a sense that oh, there's a linguistic diversity among the Greeks themselves. There's maybe differences of dialect. We have these 90 cities. It's not clear whether each of these 90 cities is monolingual or if they have a mixture of different Greeks, ethnic Greeks among them. Um, but it is always, what I can say is it is always marked when the narration draws our attention to linguistic diversity because it makes you, one, it gives, as the reader, you this awareness that, oh, maybe there's something that there's linguistic differences or code switching that we aren't privy to because of the really stylized and literary nature of the Greek that we're working with. But that is a dynamic that was possible all along. Um, but a similar question could be asked of the Iliad, where the Trojans and the Greeks are presumably speaking different languages. But there, a similar dynamic comes up when Iris in disguise is talking to Hector, and she says, you need to talk to all of the different generals because of the mercenaries, because they all speak different languages. So entrust these instructions to each of the generals so they can tell their own armies, because there's no way you can communicate to them. And they're a similar like unveiling of the social and ethnic reality of the people we're thinking about is unveiled. So I don't know whether, what we can really say firmly about this other than it is marked, if not intentional, when linguistic difference is brought up in the text. And it does, exactly as you pointed out, Larry, make you wonder, everybody is speaking Greek, but like, what is the reality of communication? What's going on? And also the fact that we got Odysseus's journey through his own vocalization, like what really was going on there? You can do a lot of really inventive thinking about how those interactions took place. And the fact that everybody is also like, this is all like culturally idiomatic Greek that is being asked, right? And so when the Cyclops doesn't ask the right question or the right salutation is not given, this is supposed to shock a sensible, like a sensibly Greek audience. So I think this is all a really great way of getting us to think about like, wait, who's telling the story? What else is lurking below the surface that maybe we're not privy to? Um, but after he tells this story about the Cretan lie, um, what I always find very, very suspicious is on 368, around 210, we get this beautiful simile of Penelope crying as she listens. Her tears flow down as she listens, the drops melting from her skin, just as snow upon towering mountains melts away. Um, so did this woman cry, this woman mourning the husband who was sitting right there. But Odysseus felt pity deep in his heart for his wife as she sobbed for him, though his eyes stayed perfectly still between their lids, as if they were made of horn or of iron. Crafty, he hid his tears. I don't know how this struck people, but it's like this remarkable sign of restraint, but he seems slightly less moved than at least with the Argos scene, which I always find very, very funny. So there's this sense of diffidence towards Penelope too. We get the sense that he doesn't fully trust her either. Um, I think somebody put into the chat something that I wanted to talk about as well. On line 107 earlier on in book 19, Mendelssohn translates Ogunai in Greek, his first address to from Odysseus to Penelope, as my white hyphen lady, which is a great way of playing on the fact that gune is the same word for wife and lady or woman in Greek. Um, so he may be, there's no, stumbling in the Greek, but I really liked that translation choice as something that brings out that ambiguity. Um, so something that I wanted to read is this like very odd dream scene. There's so many omens, there's so many dreams. I've rambled, but I could ramble for a long time about the dream scene. Um, but we might read it as another way in which, Penelope maybe tests Odysseus um, and provokes him in her own way. So this is right at the end of book 19, around the 540s, when she rejoins him and says, let me ask you something else. Um, I want to see how you interpret this dream. So let me share my screen again. And then she says, come now hear my dream, and tell me what it means. In the house there are 20 geese, all mine, which far from the water eat up the wheat. The sight of them always warms my heart. A huge eagle came down from the mountain, its beak curved like a hook, and broke their necks, killing them all. Piles of them were heaped through the halls while the eagle rose into the dazzling sky. And the eagle develops a human voice and says, daughter of Icarius, whose renown spreads far, fear not. No dream, but a vision was this, which shall come true. The geese are the suitors, and I, who before was that bird of yours, have now returned. The eagle, your very own husband, who will visit upon all the suitors a most hideous fate. Um, and I wanted to just point out this really fascinating thing that's going on in the Greek, which is also an aspect of ancient dream interpretation. And if you're interested in also maybe like Freudian psychoanalysis and dream interpretation, there's this idea that language in the dream or symbols, which can be translated into language, kind of reveal the right way to interpret something. And this is already going on in this dream in a Homeric text, which is really cool. So the eagle the eagle's interpretation kind of already contains this punning. It's not a dream, onar, but a hupar, reality. The eagle, toi aetos ornis, is actually auteteos posis. So you can kind of hopefully hear in the Greek the similarity. This bird of yours, the eagle, is actually your husband coming again. So this is not, my reading. This is the reading of a wonderful scholar of dream interpretation, ancient dream interpretation at Princeton, Miriam Kotwick, who does this really great reading. And Penelope's reply to Odysseus kind of also reveals a similar encoding that is really tricky of these two, of this idea of encoded symbols in the dream and their right meaning. So she talks about, Odysseus says, okay, the eagle must be right. He must be coming back. And she says, I don't know. I don't know if the dream came through the gate of horn, kerasi, or ivory, elefanti. And here, one might be wondering, I don't know if, this is in the footnotes of the Mendelssohn, but the dreams that that will foretell the truth are made of horn, and the false dreams go through the gate of ivory. And there's some punning going on here because elephas sounds like this verb elepharontai, for cheat or deceive. And then the horn, keras, sounds like kraino, which is this verb meaning to realize something or a reality. And what's interesting is she calls her dream an ainon onear, this harrowing or scary dream. But ainon sounds a lot like ainos, riddle in Greek. So you can like peel back in the Greek, especially all these layers to get a sense that, maybe Penelope is setting up her own kind of riddle for Odysseus to test him. And the fact that like she cries in the dream upon seeing the geese being murdered by this eagle has always been read by some scholars at least as the sign that maybe it's a repressed desire for the suitors, that she now has to like shovel into the right, home joy at the homecoming of Odysseus, but it's there in the dream and it's repressed. But that's just something going on below the surface. So I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask people related to this scene. Firstly, do we think Odysseus should have revealed himself to Penelope? Why or why not? What do we make of this test that he subjects her to? So I'm gonna see if I can pop this into the chat really quickly, or you can hopefully scan the QR code. Why Telemachus and not Penelope? Yeah, I see somebody in the chat point out he was warned by Agamemnon to be careful, whose wife, of course, is very much not faithful to him, and so Agamemnon puts the fear of women into him, um, in the underworld scene. Yeah. Okay. So answers are rolling in. So great. No, she already knows and they're communicating in code. Um, no, leave Penelope alone. Horrible way to treat your wife by making her go through a test. At first, I thought Odysseus should have revealed himself, but Penelope's just as shifty, so maybe not. Um, no, not yet. She's related to Clytemnestra and to Helen. Really great observation, right? So like there's a good sister, bad sister, um, or like good, relative, bad relative going on there. I think both Odysseus and Penelope are testing each other's fidelity. Great point. This is also going to come up later on. I wondered why he waited so long. He really didn't seem to trust her. Yeah, yeah, definitely people are picking up on the fact that this heightens a lot of dramatic tension. Like what it feels like the book 17 to 20 do, as on top of giving us a lay of this world that we haven't really seen from the inside in quite this way yet, is like exposing Odysseus's relationships to his closest people in his life through a very Odyssean way. Those who are able to recognize him despite him, those who are able to match him in wits and words at his level, right? Maybe Penelope answers, maybe the dream is invented, and she responds in this, riddling way in order to answer his lie about being a Cretan prince. Um, we might see this as like other ways that we broaden the characterization of this relationship, and more trials to come, obviously, in 21 to 24. But I really love the reading of this encounter between them that sets up Penelope as being very much intellectually authoritative and able to turn the tables on Odysseus and also destabilize him a little bit in his own game, because she gives him the answer to the dream, so she doesn't need him to interpret it, but and says, well, I don't know if the dream is true. So she's also putting him a little bit off his game in a lot of ways by saying, who knows? I guess I'll have to see the hupar, the reality, to know what the meaning of the onar, the dream, is. Um, so yeah, it's a super interesting scene. And I think people have already answered my second question in this question, which is that, do you think Penelope knows that the beggar is Odysseus? Why or why not? And that's also a huge kind of scholarly question, is like, does the real recognition, I don't know how familiar people are. I don't know that people are, I'm spoiling this, but there is a like proper recognition that involves signs. We can think of Eurycleia as a kind of parallel to this, where Penelope proposes her own sign later on to Odysseus, but we might see this as like a first recognition scene, as subtly revealed by the fact that Penelope tests Odysseus in this way. Um, and I think maybe the last, maybe unsettling like omen. There's so many, and I know I'm kind of going over time. Cecily, cut me off if if I'm going over time.
You're good, don't worry.
Yeah, um, is this final moment in book 20 after this encounter between Penelope and Odysseus, where we see Athena up to her tricks again. Um, right at the end of book 20, which is really striking. At on page 391, around line 345, Pallas Athena provoked a fit of unstoppable laughter in the suitors and addled their wits. They went on laughing and laughing as if their jaws were not their own. The meat that they were eating was fouled with blood, and their eyes were filling up with tears. Their hearts foresaw lamentation. Then Theoclymenus, godlike man, spoke a word to them all. Alas, you wretches, what evil is this that you suffer? Your heads and your faces and your limbs are all shrouded in darkness. A wailing now flares up. Your cheeks are drenched in tears. Blood is spattered all over the walls. The entry is filled with ghosts. The sun has been blotted from the sky while a foul mist covers all. So we get this incredible scene of hysteria and really ghostly, like nightmarish uh this like reaction they can't control on the part of the suitors, and the fact that the walls are running in blood. It's very explicit, like what's going to happen to the suitors right at this hinge point, before the action actually breaks out. And it's an incredible scene, and it one may can think about all the other ways that like the body betrays what's happening throughout these books, like Telemachus's sneeze that gets read as a sign of good fortune, and approval of Penelope's wish for what to happen. The fact that the suitors laugh inappropriately and can't control themselves is read as a bad omen. So part of, I think, like the enigmatic nature of these books also is just that we get this huge system of codes, um, by on the body, in reactions that people have physically, in the tests that Odysseus sets up, and in some ways is like foiled by the tests that people are putting up against him as well. And it'll be really interesting for everybody to see how those tests then bear fruit in the much more obvious confrontations that are to come, in books 21 to 24. So maybe I'll end there. And yeah, thank you for everybody's engagement and responses. I really loved seeing everybody's reaction to what's going on with the suitors, what's going on with Penelope. Um, I just love these books, and I hope this demystified them slightly.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. That was really fantastic. I feel like I had always thought about how, time kind of stops for all the people we like in the household, but you really helped me see what's happening to the suitors during this time. So that was really fantastic and loved hearing what everyone else had to say. So we'll open up the breakout rooms now and we'll meet again in May for our final session. Thank you again, Professor Lee, for setting us up so well for the dramatic ending. And yeah, thank you all for being here and see you next time.